So last week, I told you, I offered you an interpretation of two foundational stories, right? Well, more than two, but roughly speaking, two. The creation stories, because there's two of them in Genesis, and then also the story of the Buddha. And I was presenting you with a proposition, and it's a multi-layered proposition. The first proposition is that the archetypal story structure that we've already been discussing is reflected in detail in those stories. And the archetypal story structure is something like the existence of a pre-existing state where things are roughly functional, so that you might think of that as the state of things going well. And that's a state where your perceptions and your plans are sufficiently developed so that when you act them out in the world, not only do you get what you desire, but the story itself validates itself through your actions, right? Because what happens when you act something out and you get what you intend, just like when you use a map and get where you're going, not only does that get you to where you're going, but it also validates the plan or the map. And so that's a definition of truth. That's a pragmatic definition of truth. This is the sort of thing that I was trying to have a discussion with about Sam Harris, because the idea is that we have to orient ourselves in a world where our knowledge is always insufficient. We never know everything about anything. And so the question then is, how can you ever make a judgment about whether or not you're correct? And the answer to that is something like, well, you lay out a plan, and you can think about it this way. This is actually an answer to the postmodernist problem of how is it that you determine whether or not your interpretation of the world is, we won't say correct, because that's not exactly right, but you know, the postmodernists object, say with regards to the interpretation of a text, that there's a very large number of variations of ways in which that text can be interpreted, and that's actually true. And it's the same, it's actually a reflection of a deeper claim, which they sometimes also make, which is, well, if that's true for a text, which isn't as complex as everything, although it's complex, then it's even more true for everything, which is to say, the world lays itself out in a very complex manner, and you can interpret that in a very large number of ways, so who's to say which interpretation is correct? Okay, fair enough, it's a reasonable objection, and it's tied in with even a deeper problem, which is the problem of perception itself, because if the world is laid out in a manner that's exceptionally complex, then how is it that you can even perceive it? Well, that's partly the question that we're trying to answer, and the answer to that is, well, you have evolved perceptual structures, and they're actually oriented towards specific goals.